Jennifer.
Yes, Sarah.
It's October. It's like deep into October.
I know. You know what I realized? We have all these like lists, all these things we need to get done.
By the end of the year, we're like, we got
everything.
For some reason, the end of the year is like important in some way, even though the beginning of the season is in October. So we don't, what are we doing?
But I was like, we still have to do Banter Plus. That's what's on the list.
We do. Everyone, if you really like the beginnings of these episodes where we just yammer at each other, Banter Plus is a full
for you.
Hour and sometimes more available to you if you join the Discord. No, if you join the Patreon, which is patreon.com/fatedmates, which we usually talk about at the end, but now we've done it at the beginning. I got to tell you something, though. Something really important is happening in my life right now.
Tell me.
The Old School Romance Book Club, which is the Facebook group that I started 10
It's got to be more
years
than
ago.
that because...
No, it's 10 and a half years ago.
Okay.
My baby was a literal, I was holding her in arms when I started. I can see myself literally learning how to build a group on Facebook, right? I started this group 10 and a half years ago for people who wanted to reread like the romance classics, the old school romances, with the understanding that like there be
Sure.
You know,
here be dragons, right?
there be dragons, right? Like, we don't know what's in these books, but we're starting. The first book we read was Jude Devereaux's A Knight in Shining Armor. We read, like, Bewitching by Jill Barnett. We read The Gift. We read, like, all of the big old classics, right? We would read one book a month. And then it became more, it started out with like, I don't know, 100 readers of mine who had said they wanted to join this like kind of book club experience. And then it became more and more and more. And ultimately there were more than 10,000 members in this group. And it really became like a place on the internet where we could hang out and talk about romance novels, right? And that place didn't really exist. Like, there was Smart Bitches, but you had to kind of like be part of that community and be a blog goer. There was Dear Author, and it sort of did that. But like Old School was really like open to anybody who had a Facebook account, and it was a more casual experience, right? You would just see it in your Facebook feed. Well, like as time went by, other things popped up, right? Like Twitter started to happen. Like you could join like the Romancelandia Twitter places. You could join all the like pop-up Discords. You could join the like Reddit for romance. And so we started, you know, kind of like people were getting disparate. Then there was a few years ago that sort of mass exodus post-election from Facebook. And like people don't really go to Facebook anymore. And it sort of got quieter and quieter. And I kind of stopped going to Facebook. And Fated Mates started, and people started hanging out with us on Twitter with you and on Instagram with me. And then we opened the Discord. And so like that happened. And so we decided this week that it's time. And we talked it all through, like the amazing admins, Colleen and Sam and Cheryl and Sab all got together, and we sort of talked through like what we wanted to do with this thing that we had built, because it was this very cool thing. Like, it's how Shannon Donahue like came to romance through their like drawing, like with all her romance art. Like, it was this very cool thing that we built that really was important to a lot of people, especially me. So we decided this week that we're gonna put it to bed. We decided the worst thing to do would be to let it like kind of become a ghost town. So we're closing it down, everyone. And this is sort of an announcement to everybody that we are closing it down. And if you were a member of OSRBC, even if you don't go back to Facebook or whatever, we're going to have a farewell Zoom.
Oh, that's so fun.
So everybody can come and just like hang out, and like we can have one last sort of hurrah. In the olden days, we used to do Zooms once a month, and like we're going to have one last Zoom, and I'll put all the information for it in show notes because we're recording before the Zoom is planned, but it's going to happen. We'll put the dates in show notes, and I hope you'll all come and hang out.
You know, I mean, it's funny that you said the election, because that's when I did quit Facebook, was like after election. And I feel like I might be ready to quit Twitter because of this one. So maybe elections are social media killers, right?
That man sort of is making it very difficult to support him.
Here's the thing I wanted to say, though. I don't want to talk about that.
except to say, join us for phone banking this Saturday, everyone. Fatedmates.net/fatedstates. All gas, no brakes. We got to get this done. And that's the end of that. We've said it.
Okay, here is what I was going to say, though, back to when you were sort of talking about, like, you know, kind of like reading old stuff and what it's like. So there's been some discussion in some social media spaces about, like, how to delineate the difference between, like, things that are problematic versus things that are dated. And I think that's, like, a really interesting conversation in romance as well. Because, obviously, I'm not going to look at an old book and say, oh, it's, you know, homophobic or racist. That is problematic, and it always was. But I do think that there are ways in which especially our conceptions of, like, gender, our conceptions of sexual identity, our conceptions of, you know, like, sort of people's sexual drive or needs or, like, right, any number of things, and is always evolving. Like, our understanding is so different now than it was 10 years ago or 20 years ago or 40 years ago. And it's going to be the case too, right? Like, we're going to say things now that seem like super on the cutting edge of how we talk about it. And in 10 years, they're going to be like, oh my God, I can't believe we said that, right? So I really thought that that was, like, useful for me to think about as well, because I think sometimes problematic has become sort of this catch-all. Like, and yes, if somebody wrote it that way now, it would be problematic, right? But absent, like, actual, absent, like, sort of thinking about where, I think for me, it was just useful to think, like, sometimes the words we use or the ideas we have are dated because we didn't know about the things we know now, right?
Mm-hmm. But also, like, sometimes there's just shit in those books that you have to pretend you don't see. Like, that you somehow missed when you were there the first time, and now you're just coming at it with fresher.
And sometimes there's some of that stuff, like, I would never recommend anymore, right? Like, white authors writing Native American, like, right? Like, some of that stuff you're like, okay, I read it. We all did. Now we know better, and there's no way to even, like, sort of crawl past it. But I do think that there are other ways when I read things where I think this just feels dated. It feels dated. It feels like this is how it was at the time. This were the people, you know. So anyway, I just thought, I'm not sure how and when things will feel problematic versus dated for me, but I did find myself thinking that feels like a very useful way to, like, kind of delineate between this felt right at the time and now we just know better versus this has always been kind of wrong. Yeah.
And I think, like, one of the things that we try to do on the podcast. Oh, welcome everyone to Fated Mates. I'm Sarah McLean. I read romance novels and I write them.
And I'm Jennifer Prokop, a romance reader and editor.
And I think one of the things that we do on the podcast, or that at least we try to do when we talk about these books that are older, and, like, come from the OG romances, right? Is we try to name it, right? Like, there are issues with this book that are about, like, you know, ethnocentrism or racism or fat phobia or, you know, whatever the many things are, right? And we acknowledge that they exist because I think it's impossible not to acknowledge that they exist. But I think one of the things that really, at the beginning of, speaking of old school, of the Facebook group, at the beginning, there was this one thing that I remember happened over and over and over again. Anytime we read one of the books, somebody would come on and be like, for example, A Knight in Shining Armor, right? A great book. A great Jude Deveraux book. Widely believed to be, like, one of the favorites of hers. And it is immensely fatphobic.
Yeah.
Like, almost unreadable for me now, like the initial couple of chapters because of the fat phobia in it. And of course, like, I don't think I clocked it as a child, right? But I remember now, I mean, like, I remember reading it in the book club, and people would be like, well, that's just the way it was back then. Right. And, like, listen, right? Everyone was buying meth from Ladies' Home Journal ads, right? So yeah, for sure. But the reality is that we can say it, name it, and still enjoy the book, right? Like, and I think, like, I can remember a decade ago that being a very difficult thing to explain to people. Like, you can have a problematic fave. Like, and as long as you acknowledge, like, there are problematic things in this. And, like, you warn people that they're there. And I think now, though, interestingly, you don't hear that as much. That's sort of like, that's just the way it was.
I mean, I think the part that's interesting, of course, is like when you read as many romances as I read, as we read, the things that stick with us are not those things, right? Like, I've gone back to books and been like, holy crap, this is in here, and then truly been shocked, right? And
because we don't remember it.
We don't remember.
When I reread that as a grown-up, I was like, holy crap.
Yeah.
I had no idea.
And you know, and truly though, I think if someone was like, this to me is a deal breaker, understood. Like, I would never convince anybody that they were wrong, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think, I just thought it was interesting. This is dated, right? This is dated.
But, it's not dated.
We are doing a read along this week, a deep dive of the duology by Molly O'Keefe. The first one is called The Truth About Him. The second one is called...
No, the first one is called Everything I Left Unsaid. I was like, I did not read that. I read a different book.
These have been real favorites of mine for a long time. And so...
Well, you have been talking about these books on the podcast you talk about them at least once a season.
I think that these 4 books, the first 2 are a duology, the next 2 are standalones, to me are pretty close, like, would definitely make it onto my, like, if you were like top 10 series you've ever read, these books would appear. And they are notable, I think, for me also because everyone knows I don't read a cliffhanger. And I think this is the first book I read with a cliffhanger. And I was like, oh, shit, I got to read the next one. And I bought the next one probably. I actually should look because, Amazon will tell you. I bought Everything I Left Unsaid on July 18th, 2016. And I bought The Truth About Him on July 19th, the next day. Summertime reading for me. I had to know what had happened. Since then, I actually am a lot more careful. I don't stumble into cliffhangers accidentally anymore. But I think the other thing about this is we're going to talk about the structure and why I think it was real interesting the way it's set up. But I also want to talk about this as being one of a handful of books that I resisted reading. I'd been hearing about it. And then, but I felt like it was like kind of like that whatever the gimmick was, I wasn't interested in it. Because, and so and it was this book, it was Never Sweeter by Charlotte Stein was the same way for me. It was The Deal by Elle Kennedy because the gimmick was they were college kids. Yeah, I just was kind of like, I don't know that that's for me. And it's such a specific hook that if you're not sure it's for you, it's easy to like kind of be like, whatever. But then I guess I got talked into it.
This week's episode of Fated Mates is sponsored by How My Neighbor Stole Christmas by Megan Quinn.
So you would think a man named Cole Black would be, not move into a Christmas town. And yet there he is, the caroling, the decorations, all the insanely cheery spirit all the time. So he just hibernates away in his cave, house, fine, keeping a healthy distance from all that holly jolly nonsense. And everything was going according to plan until his arch nemesis, Story Taylor, moves in next door to care for her Aunt Cindy. And before you know it, his own street has got all of this Christmas nonsense. And so he is kind of mad about it, and she's real excited to enter the town's Kris Kringle contest and is determined to win. And so he, as any romance hero would do, decides to enter in order to win himself and deny her very joyful plans. So unfortunately, in his quest to make everyone in town believe that his, cold dead heart has grown 3 sizes that year, he in fact falls in love with Story. They're pretending to date and kissing, and all of a sudden, maybe all that Christmas stuff is pretty great. And so his heart grows 3 sizes, something else does too, and before you know it, we've got an explosive Christmas story of a man finding his way.
You all know that Megan Quinn is going to deliver a great idea, a strong rom-com vibes, and a very spicy holiday romance. So if this sounds like something you'd like to find in your stocking, you can find How My Neighbor Stole Christmas right now in print, ebook, audiobook, or with your monthly subscription to Kindle Unlimited. In special podcasting apps, you can click on the chapter title right now to be taken to buy the book. And thanks to Megan Quinn, as always, for sponsoring this week's episode.
The hook of this book is Annie is on the run from her abusive husband, and she lands in this trailer. She's from Oklahoma, lands in this trailer park in North Carolina, and a phone rings in a drawer. She essentially is like a new tenant in this trailer. And Dylan is the man on the other side, and he asks her to watch, essentially keep an eye out on the man who lives in the trailer next to her for Dylan. That's what he wants her to do, and he's willing to pay her. And the gimmick of the book is that they only are talking on the phone to each other for probably the first 3/4 of this book, that they don't.
It's so great, though.
They don't see each other. They don't. It is just the phone. And I was kind of like, how? Well, because Molly O'Keefe's a fucking genius. That's how.
She's so good.
Yeah.
She's so good. I mean, I feel like I read them like right when they came out.
Yeah. And I didn't. I resisted. I really was like, I don't think that's going to be for me. And I finally read them because I was just like, everyone knows that, like, get them together on page. How can this possibly work? Right.
Well, as you know, I don't care about that. As long as they are together. Here's what I will say. They are together.
They are together on page.
Like,
right.
There is like some of the hottest phone sex in romance in this book.
Oh my God. Yes.
Right.
God.
They are, and it is so emotional from the jump. Like, to the point where I was rereading it this week, and I was thinking to myself, like, there were moments where I went back to really look at the craft of that first phone conversation, which is like no amount of time. They talk
almost immediately
for no amount of time. And it's the first thing that happens in the book. And like somehow instantly, like there's just the tension is just pulled so tight right away. It's wild how she does it. It is a masterclass in like tension. And then on top of it, she builds Annie, the heroine, this like really rich community of people who are also all like mysteries. Everyone in the story is a mystery. Everyone is keeping secrets. No one is what they seem. And then when she gets to, it's like 60% of the way through the book, the whole story the secrets start to like quietly unravel. And all we know for the whole book is her secret. We know one person's story. And then at about 60% of the way through, we start to see the truth of everyone else in the story. And it's so beautifully knitted together. It's really a gorgeous book. It's so well done. The craft is just the best of us.
I don't know how to talk about these books as anything but like one, right? They're 2 books.
Right.
But
So when I mean, like that was Everything I Left Unsaid, but yes. And then there's a cliffhanger.
So maybe let's talk a little bit about structure first, because the thing that is fascinating to me is that in Everything I Left Unsaid, it is Annie's book. I didn't count, but it is not even narration. It doesn't go Annie Dillon, right? But Annie's narration is in first person and Dylan's narration is in third. This is 2018 or 2015 it was written, so it's all in past tense. Mm-hmm. Annie is in first, Dylan's in third. And then at the cliffhanger, in book 2, which is The Truth About Him, it switches. and Dylan's is first, and Annie is in third. And book 2 is really Dylan's book. So what you see is, I mean, and this is the part that I don't think I've ever seen anybody do anything like this since, is to say, like, and so in some ways, part of the reason the cliffhanger works for me, it's not just because it ends genuinely at a moment where
devastating.
It's devastating. We'll talk about, I think, plot in a little bit, but that moment really does kind of like switch off who is taking the lead in the story, who is in control or out of control, right? Who is on the way up versus on the way down. And I think that in that sense, it truly feels like often cliffhangers to me feel unearned. I don't know any other way to say it, right? Like it feels like, you know, something happened, you're just going to stop there. And, you know, that's okay. I'm not saying that in a terrible way. It's what it is. I don't enjoy them. But in this case, this cliffhanger feels really earned, like truly deeply organic to Annie's story and Annie's arc. And then the way the books themselves are written couldn't be any, right, also kind of make the case for it needing to be 2 books. So I think that that's the part that also is really fascinating to me, and was fascinating to me on the reread even, right? Like, how is this story, which I'm already so familiar with, being told, and who is telling which parts of it?
I mean, when you talk about that earned cliffhanger, you know, one of the challenges, and I was thinking actually today because I'm teaching my conflict class right now, and somebody in the conflict class asked about second books, right? Like, how do you keep the conflict heightened in a second book? And I actually recommended that they go listen to the episode of the podcast that we did with Sarah J. Maas, where she talked about, like, you know, how to do a second book and how to, like, really hold the tension tight. But I think this is, again, like a master class in that sort of second book question, because what she does in the first book is build up. One of the things I talk about a lot, and we talk about it too when we talk about conflict, is like, what is a character unwilling to sacrifice, right? Like, what is the one thing that if we put we put their back against the wall and we say, like, your full life or this thing, they will choose that thing instead. And I think that's the sort of backbone of good conflict in a novel. And what she does here, what Molly does here, and then of course, like in a romance novel, at the end of the book, there is a sacrifice that has to be made, and they have to choose love over that thing that they were unwilling to sacrifice. And Annie in this book, like, she really, like, what Molly O'Keefe gives her is this thing that, like, we understand intuitively. Like, what Annie has to sacrifice is her freedom and her life, like her safety. Like, the thing she is unwilling to sacrifice is safety, literal physical safety in this book. And she sacrifices it at the end of the cliffhanger in the first book for all these people that we have met. And it is really, like, it is one of the most heroic acts in romance. Like, what happens at the end of this first book.
Yeah. So I think the thing we should maybe do is talk about, I don't know, like, I guess we're going to talk about the 2 books separately.
Plot.
Yeah, let's talk about the plot. So Annie shows up at this trailer park, right? Her husband had strangled her and left her for dead on the kitchen floor. Or just left her, like, he just left her. And knowing what I know now, right, like, which is that this is the major, like, this man's going to kill you. If you know, this, like, PSA, if someone strangles you, right?
Intimate partner violence involving strangulation is likely directly correlated to death.
Yes. And not that he'll kill you by strangling you, but that he'll kill you, right? Like, it's just a real sign. And so Hoyt is her husband, and, you know, and what happened is he wanted her, the farm was hers. Her mother died. He'd been a worker on the farm. He kind of slides in and takes over, and, you know, she marries him, and she doesn't realize that he really was just after the land. And so and this takes a while to come out, right? But she wakes up, realizes that he's going to kill her if she sticks around, steals $3,000 of money out of cash out of the safe, and then like takes off, right? Like just finds a car and, you know, takes a bus and goes all around in crazy directions, and right, eventually ends up in Cherokee, North Carolina. And in this trailer park. And the man, it's really fascinating. The man who, Kevin, who like sort of rents her the place, she asks if he knows anything about work, which of course everything has to be off the books, right? Everything has to be like, she can't pop her head out in any way. And he agrees to let her essentially do like yard work, right? Like labor around the campsite, right? Cleaning out this field and taking out garbage and cutting weeds and riding the mower and things like that. And this is appealing to her because she's so terrified even of like being seen, right? Like it's like, this feels like the safest place she could imagine. So when Dylan calls, and Dylan was an ex-race car driver, and he had been in a terrible accident where his car caught on fire, and he caught on fire. And he has since become an incredibly wealthy man, because it turns out that he is way better at building engines, right? He has all these patents for like essentially race car engines that have made him and his partner Blake multimillionaires. So he owns a mountain, right?
Like Cliffhanger.
Very classic romance setup, right?
He's a cinnamon roll compared to a Lothair, but he does own a mountain.
He is like just up, and he is hiding from the world as well, right? Like he is, every time he goes out, people stare at him. Even when his partner forces him to go to like racing events, it's like people want to do business with him, but they can't quite meet his eye, and he knows that, right? He's very aware of the fact that he is the walking embodiment of all of their worst nightmares, which is, right, a wreck, a crash, dying in a race. So he is hiding too, right? And the two of them have these phone conversations, and it turns out that what he wants her to do is watch out for Ben, who lives next door. And she just thinks of him as like kind of an old, helpless man. But Dylan is like, no, he's very dangerous. I just don't get anywhere near him. I just want you to watch him and report to me, and I'll pay you. And what really catches his attention is that she's like, well, why would you pay me for that? I can just tell you how he's doing. It's fine. Right? That's like a nice thing to do. It's a kind thing to do. And this really catches his attention because not very many people have been kind to Dylan in his life. And then the other women in the trailer park, the other characters we meet, are Joan, who's a stripper who lives on the other side of her. And then Tiffany, who is a single mom of like 3 kids. Oh, no, not a single mom. Well, not a single mom. Phil kind of blows in and out, but he is also abusive. And Annie recognizes that in Tiffany, recognizes her own fear, recognizes the bruises, and, you know, and so, but I think in some ways helps Annie realize how lucky she was that they didn't have kids, right? Like that the added level of control and fear that Tiffany lives with because of her children. And this little band of misfits in the trailer park becomes
her family.
It's fascinating.
Well, Molly does this really interesting thing where like she delivers Annie a group of very decent people in this place. Like you could easily, like when you meet Kevin, the boss, right? Like initially he could easily have been like kind of a gross, like greaser slime ball, right? But he isn't. Like one of the first things he does is say like, you're exhausted. Why don't you take the day off? You know, like, and I think there's that. And then, you know, the first thing Ben does for all that she's been warned away from him, he has this beautiful garden and he like gives her food and like makes sure that he like makes her a sandwich. And, you know, Joan's hot and swims naked with her. This week's episode of Fated Mates is sponsored by Athon Books, publishers of Belle Walker's Blood and War.
Romanticy, friends, we are here for you. And so what we have this time is a fated encounter between Demetria and Kellen, who is one of the four horsemen of the apocalypse, codename War. I'm not sure you need to know anything more, but in this case, Demetria is fighting on one side, right? Like, there's a string of demon attacks coming towards her and this, like, her loved one. She has these like nightmarish creatures that she is trying to fight off. Meanwhile, Kellen, right, has been sent down to restore the balance to Earth along with his siblings, the other horsemen of the apocalypse. And he thinks this is going to be a simple assignment. But when he meets Demetria, it's this like chance fated encounter. He realizes that maybe the council is not being entirely honest with them. And he has a lot of questions that they won't answer. So War and Demetria organize themselves together in an uneasy alliance, but as their attraction makes things more complicated, that hostility turns into something fiery and beautiful. So are the consequences of these feelings going to be deadly? Probably, but I also think it's going to be a great read.
You can read Blood and War in print, ebook, audiobook, or with your monthly subscription to Kindle Unlimited. And in special podcasting apps, you can click on the chapter title right now to be taken to buy the book. Thanks to Athon Books for sponsoring this week's episode.
Now, meanwhile, Dylan's point of view, is he's like a tuning fork for her, right? Like he just senses her awakening. And it's a very sensual awakening. This is the other thing. Like, romance is sexy, but this book is sensual, right? Her eating tomato sandwiches with mayonnaise on a hot day. Her and Joan swimming in this pond, which is like the field is disgusting, but the pond is beautiful. It's a beautiful swimming hole. The way it describes how hot she is at night in the trailer. The color of her clothes, and her arousal, right, when she talks to Dylan. Everything about this book is just like...
Yeah, it's like a really humid book.
Yeah. And that's it. It's like the writing itself is hot, humid, sweaty, August, North Carolina, right? And Dylan, meanwhile, is like up on his mountain, right, trying to stay cool, literally, but he can't bring himself to like step away from his phone, right? It's one of the, as ironic as this is, it's like one of the few books, even though it's almost 10 years old at this point, I think that really captures how technology like replaces, we become obsessed with it. And so Blake is like, you won't even leave your phone. What's going on? And it's because Dylan knows that she might call at any minute.
He's obsessed with her. Listen, this book deploys Are You Okay? In this like way that it feels like visceral. Every time they speak, right? His first question to her is, are you okay? Like, are you okay? And no one has ever worried about her before. Like, no one has ever taken care of her before. No one has ever put her safety and security ahead of their own. And also pleasure, right? Like, and every moment with Dylan at the beginning of this book, like on the phone, is about her. Is she okay? Does it feel good? Has she had pleasure that day? Like, did you want to skinny dip? You should skinny dip. You want to eat dessert for breakfast? You should do that. Like, all he cares about is like her just having joy. And it's like, it's a drug. It's a drug for him, and it becomes a drug for us in the writing of it. It's really gorgeous. And like there are these moments you talk about, like all of the sensation of this book, but like every time he laughs on the phone,
She feels it.
It feels like you can hear it in your mind as you're reading. Like it is so incredibly sexy, this book.
I think the thing that's so I mean, I want to talk about sex eventually, but
right,
yeah, but
I
sexy,
mean sexy,
right?
just
No,
in like
right? Like again, like sensual, right? Like it's just Annie is feeling her body really for the first time, and her own will. And I think the thing that's also really interesting about this book, though, is I think it really it threads a lot of really interesting needles. So Dylan is very controlling in the sense that he is like, so you mentioned the skinny dipping and the cake, right? It's like, you can't call me again until you've skinny dipped and you've had dessert for breakfast. Like he's like setting these boundaries and rules for her. And it's really interesting watching Annie kind of, and this is the part, right? Like this is an abused woman. She's very young. She's 24. She got married, essentially right after her mother died, to this man. She's never, and he isolated her. She used to love going to church. And he, stopped her from going to church. She had the foreman on the ranch was almost like a father to her. And Hoyt made her fire him. And so she's completely isolated and alone. And she really never had those experiences of like making friends with women and deciding if they're trustworthy or not, right? And so one of the things that's really interesting is the first time Dylan kind of sets a boundary with her, you see her deciding whether or not like he's going to be like Hoyt, right? And I think this is very smart. Because I think it shows like she's so hyper aware of the fact that in the wrong man, right, that kind of controlling nature could be abusive. But is it with Dylan is something she has to figure out for herself. And I think the reason the phone part of it works so well, right, is that she is like tethered to him, but not in any sort of real way. Like, right? It's just her in the trailer park, right? Trying to figure out who these people are, trying to figure out who she is. I mean, and that's the part too, like, we talk about like people lie to themselves all the time, right? And here is Annie, like really literally trying to figure out like, what's it going to cost for me to like live, right? And that's the thing, like Ben and Joan both say something to her basically about like, what are you doing here? And she says like running, like it's obvious to everybody that she has run. And they're like, yeah, no, we got that. Now what are you going to do? And that is like, talk about a fascinating place to start, right? She's already done the hardest thing, but that means there's nothing left. She has to make it up. Like this is a woman inventing herself right in front of our eyes, right?
Quite literally, like from page 1, from when he asks for her name, right? And she tells him her name is Layla because her cousin Layla like got out. Her cousin Layla, like, everybody thought Layla was like slutty and like, shameful, but like she got out and now she has a good life in California. And so Annie claims that name as hers. We would be remiss not to talk about how very carefully this book tackles intimate partner violence, right? And the like way that it consumes Annie. Like when her first interaction with Tiffany and the kids is a birthday party, she immediately recognizes that Tiffany is in the same place as she was. Tiffany's terrible husband, boyfriend, father of her children turns up. And the writing in that scene is really deft and emotional because we're deep in Annie's point of view. We have to talk about point of view too, but we're deep in Annie's point of view. And she has this moment where she's like, I have to get out of here. You have to get out of here. Be careful. Like she's like war gaming this like children's birthday party. And it is really intense. And then on top of it is the kind of awareness of what she looks like, her scarf, like putting on the big glasses, the sort of very real sense of like how she is hiding like the shame of her own abuse. And I think that this is one of those moments where I think to myself, like, I wish every person who read It Ends With Us, like, then came and read these books, because I think Molly really does deliver the like deep work of domestic violence in these books and to Happily Ever After.
Well, and I think that that's the thing that is where, okay, so it's kind of like I've told you it's Annie's book, right? But like, what's Dylan's part of this? So Dylan is fascinating because what he thinks to himself is that basically, and there's this like great line, right? That it was in his nature to destroy, right? And so Dylan doesn't think he deserves anything good. And so Annie to him is this like miracle. He has, again, he's like completely tuned into her. And so he hears like this like hitch in her voice and realizes that she's turned on. And like the phone sex, like the way that like evolves feels like it could have easily been like so scummy, right? But instead it's just something they're both really into. And a lot of it, like you said at the beginning, is him like getting her off, right? But he is like so furious and angry at the world, right? That there's just no way that he's going to be good for her, because it's fascinating, right? Like these two should just not be good for each other. But as they start, again, like, right, physical intimacy, even though it's over the phone, leads to them being able to tell the truth to each other as well. Because there's also some safety in the privacy or the feeling of security that comes with them not knowing each other. Mm-hmm. Eventually she gets like a little hint, right? Like she calls and if his voicemail picks up, so she hears his name.
And that sort of throws it. That's the first secret revealed. And like the moment that secret gets revealed, it's like the outside world there's like a crack in the foundation. And then it unravels really, really quickly, like from there.
This week's episode of Fated Mates is brought to you by 1001 Dark Nights, publishers of Audrey Carlin's A Christmas Auction, part of the Marriage Auction series.
So we've talked about Audrey Carlin's books before. Almost all of her books are written in this like marriage auction context where women basically agree to $3 million for 3 years of commitment to some, man who's very wealthy, and then also because of romance reasons is also very handsome and a perfect match. Listen, I don't hate it. In this one, so Holly, our heroine, has like a terrible life. Like she's got a terrible job. She lives in Las Vegas where, she's just sort of constantly bombarded with just how tough life is. And, right before Christmas, she walks herself from work to the parking lot where her car is. And a man has followed her. And listen, Holly can take care of herself. She tases this dude. It's great.
Love it.
And then what she doesn't realize is that there's a second man there to grab her and do a little serious kidnapping. This is not light kidnapping. But lucky for Holly and for us, up comes a limousine and out pops a handsome bodyguard and a French woman, Madame Elena, who we will remember as the owner of the marriage auction. And they say to Holly, well, how about $3 million for 3 years of your life? And she's like, perfect. I will make all this money. I will end up with this like rich benefactor. This will be terrific. I'll change the course of my destiny. There's only one problem, Jen. Bruno, the hot bodyguard who hopped out of the limo.
I bet he's the one, Sarah.
He's pretty hot. And he's going to throw a wrench into this auction because they can't keep their hands off each other.
I love it. So if you would like
Merry
to read,
Christmas.
if you would like to read this grumpy sunshine, forced proximity, contemporary romance between, a woman in the right place, but with the wrong man, then you should check out A Christmas Auction. If you click on the chapter title right now, you can be taken to buy the book, which is available in print and in e. Thank you to Audrey Carlin and 1001 Dark Nights for sponsoring this week's episode. The other, specter over all of this is Annie eventually sort of figures out that Ben is Dylan's father, right? And one night, someone shows up at Ben's trailer and is yelling and screaming. And the entire trailer park is just on high alert. Again, the way that she captures the panic of a community. Everyone knowing that something dangerous has wandered in off of the right. And so and it's really interesting. The other thing that's really interesting about this is her instinct is to call the cops. And it's Joan who's you can't call the cops. Call Dylan. Call Dylan and tell him Max is here.
Yeah.
Right. And now we get a fuller picture of Dylan's family story because Max is his brother. And yeah.
Well, also we have this moment there where again, there's another crack, right? Because Dylan, she calls him, they've also not, she's told him she was never going to call him again.
Right, of course.
Right. So this is a kind of critical moment because she finds out that what his real name is, and that sends her to the library.
Use the internet.
To learn about, to Google him. Right. And so then he returns to, he called, the next time they speak, he's basically we have to be done. She lets real life in by asking him a question about the crash. And he's just we can't. Yeah. No, that's a no. Right? We're done. I said we weren't doing this and we're not doing this. I don't want you to whatever. And then she's fine, fuck you then. Fuck off. I will. And he's I want you to call me if you need anything. And she's I will never, ever call you for anything that I need. But she will call him for something that Ben needs. And when Joan says, call Dylan, she picks up the phone and she calls him and he answers instantly.
Right.
And he doesn't know.
And the other thing that's fascinating about this moment is again, you're wait, how does Joan know who Dylan is? Right? How does Joan know who Max is? How does Joan, right?
But it's all happening so fast that you're oh, I guess Joan knows. Joan knows everybody now. Right? And you still don't fully know how Joan is connected in until Joan reveals that she is somebody who is important to the world, and that she's undercover there in that place.
What's great is that's we find out in book 2 all a lie, but she says what she says to Annie is what Annie needs to hear, right? Annie wants to call the cops. Yeah. So it's if I'm a cop, right?
But then she says, so then Annie calls, he answers right away. She just says it's Ben, there's somebody here. She doesn't even say his name. And he knows exactly what's up. And he's get on the floor. I'm sending a car. And it's as though he has been waiting. He knew this was going to happen. And there has just been a car.
Right, there's a man in Cherokee in a motel just parked there waiting in case Dylan needs him, right? And again, it's great foreshadowing. There's just this moment and then 100 pages later or whatever, here it is, right? And Annie's wait, what are you talking about? And the car arrives, but things are scary and she jumps into it. And then this car takes her to Dylan, right? And then...
and what's amazing is it takes her up the mountain that he owns into this house where a lady is hey, are you Layla? Because of P.S. we still don't know Annie's name, right? It's all, and then she's there and she gets put into a bedroom and she has to call him because he's not
like
there.
not gonna come for her, right?
And like he's not, like he hasn't shown himself. And so she literally calls him and the motherfucker answers.
And everybody
because he cannot not answer.
Right. And I want to say this is 2/3 of the way through this book.
No, it's so great. It's a perfect example, Jen, of like when we say they have to be together on page, like if you're a great writer, you can make that happen any
but this
which
is the thing
way.
I found myself thinking, like, why are these two more like the chemistry, the intensity, right? It's such a good book.
It's so good. This book is sexier than any book I have read in the last, like, probably 2 years.
Absolutely. And I want to talk about that. Like, it's sexier, and I want to talk about sex.
We're going to get to sex,
in a little bit. But,
okay.
Well, because I guess now, right?
It, like, every word of this book is, like, lush and beautiful and so sexy. These two are hot for each other in a way I haven't read in a long time.
She calls him, and she's basically like, where are you? And he's like, in the garage, which it turns out is on the property of the mountain he owns. So she goes to him.
He's like, go through the big room. I'm like, all the rooms are big.
And he is like, in darkness, there's a pool of light on the, the desk. Like, everything is so evocative. And she can't really his back
and
to
his
her.
back
right?
is to her.
Oh, I mean,
and I'm like,
when is he going to turn around?
Is he scarred inside and out?
Yes, Sarah. Yes.
Can he not bear to show his face to her in the light?
It is so delicious. It is so perfect. Right. And so finally, right, like and here's the part about, so they meet, and it's like they meet in person after all of these intimacies they've shared. And let me tell you, they just have the hottest sex ever. And Annie feels guilty about it because now it really feels like infidelity to her. Like, he doesn't know I'm married. And she doesn't really consider herself married, right? And none of us do either.
She doesn't feel like, it's not beholden to Hoyt. It's that she feels
lied
like she
to Dylan.
is lied
and
to
that
Dylan.
Dylan might not want to have sex with a married woman, even if the circumstances are what they are, right? Yeah, it's not about Hoyt at all. It's more about if you're going to ask somebody to, like, break a rule with you or break the law, they have to know what they're doing. And this is like a big theme of the book. Because what we find out about Dylan is that when he was a teenager, Max committed a crime, but he would have gone to jail, to prison, because he was over 18, but Max was not. And so Ben, his father, asked Dylan to, like, do the time, essentially plead guilty, go to juvie. And what happened instead in juvie is that Dylan was attacked and almost killed, and instead killed somebody else. Essentially, someone came at him because of his dad's, like, affiliation with this motorcycle club. And so Dylan, who's only supposed to be in for, I think, 18 months or 2 years, ending up going to real prison because he aged out of juvie. And
he killed somebody.
Then he got out, and essentially, like, another family essentially took him in almost as like just this wild 18-year-old child, right? He never went back to Ben and Max. And his mom had left a long time ago. And the thing about, so Dylan's 29, Annie's 24. And the thing that I really appreciated about this book is that they fuck nonstop because they are young and beautiful and they cannot get enough of each other. And it is, it really feels the desperate need that they have for each other. It has been, as you said, a long time since I have read a book that is this convincing about the way that sometimes that, like, physical need you have for someone else overtakes everything else. It is all that there is. It's just what's burning brightest.
Well, so let's talk about point of view, because I know this is part of why you love this book, because it's really the structure of it. So In the first book, this is Annie's book, and her point of view is in the first person. And then Dylan's point of view, his chapters, are in the third person. And this is some interesting work in that it keeps Annie, it reveals a lot of Annie's secrets and allows Molly to keep Dylan's secrets. And then what's really interesting is so at the very end of Everything I Left Unsaid, Hoyt returns and he basically threatens Annie's community. And Annie knows that if she allows Ben or Joan or anybody to get close to Hoyt, it'll all go south and Ben will end up back in jail. And so she basically Harry and the Hendersons. Ben.
Right. Ben comes to the door. Right.
She pushes Ben away. Ben comes to the door. She pushes Ben away. She tells him everything's fine. Leave her alone. And then Hoyt takes her. And then the book ends. And then the next book begins, and we're in Annie's point of view, but it is third person. And then it flips to Dylan, who is in the first person.
It's so amazing. And it's fascinating because I really found myself thinking, I bet you $1 million that Molly and her editor talked for years about where to switch it. Because what I found really fascinating, so this part's like super spoilery, right? Is like Hoyt is essentially like has like knocked her out, right? She is beating her up. He is essentially, it's very clear, like she's sent Ben away and he knows that means you're going to come back with me. Otherwise, I'm going to hurt these people. But what happens is Ben's no dummy, right? He goes and essentially commandeers Phil, which is Tiffany's dirtbag husband, and says, call Dylan. I know you can call Dylan. It doesn't really matter why. And he's just like, you have to get down here. I think her husband's in there with her. And the thing that's fascinating is I found myself thinking, like, what would it have been like to be in Annie's point of view when this is all going down? And I think the thing is that it would have been terrifying. Right? Like, It saves us as the reader a little bit from having to really exist in the mind of a woman who worked so hard to get away, and then he came and found her. Right?
Right. And the pure terror,
like how frozen she would have been. That essentially at that moment, this is not someone who can now or later like narrate that experience. I think it really respects the idea that and I think it also respects the idea that she herself needed distance from it. Right?
And yes.
If that makes sense.
Like, that is the important piece of it. It serves us by virtue of the first time we see Dylan's point of view in the first person, he is coming undone. And there's the romance of it all.
I was going to stay distant. I was going to be up on my mountain, and now I will do anything to save her. I have realized that he does say I love her. That's like a real big journey, is like sort of him realizing what those feelings are, but that like his desperation that he will do anything to save her. So it's like it saves, and I found myself really thinking how brilliant that is, that it really allows Annie to also distance herself emotionally from what's happening, right? Mm-hmm. Because now it's like she's removed a little bit. It's not quite, it's happening to her, but it's not in some ways too.
I love it.
And then I found myself thinking, okay, so you're teaching your big conflict class right now. The conflict for Annie in book 1 essentially gets solved. All she wanted was to be away from her husband. Freedom.
Well, I mean, it doesn't get solved because she has to make that sacrifice, right? And so she does. She sacrifices her freedom and her security and her community for love, because to protect them, she has to leave. She has to go back. But I think she knows that she doesn't know.
She doesn't know Dylan's going to save her.
She believes this. Like, she is going back into the fire because she won't harm these people.
Right. And she fights him. I mean, she fights. Like, she tries to get away, but it's never going to be on the backs of them. Like, she's not going to call for help. It's like she's like, I've got to do this myself or I can't do it.
Right.
But I think the thing that's really fascinating is, okay, like, here's the big spoiler.
I mean, by this point, everybody, you should have read these books.
This week's episode of Fated Mates is brought to you by Lumi Gummies, free THC gummies delivered legally nationwide. Lumi Gummies have a whole rainbow of flavors and feels and offer sativa, hybrid, and indica effects so you can choose the kind of vibe you're looking for.
So this is really interesting because, Jen, you use them largely for sleep, and I don't have a problem usually going to sleep.
Rub it in,
one
Sarah.
of my few non-problems. I have lots of other ones. But I have been feeling a lot of, existential despair and anxiety recently. I mean, not for any reason or anything.
No. What could be about?
And no one else out there is also feeling that way. So I, find that these gummies sometimes help to just like quiet those thoughts, like just sort of give you just like a little bit of a sense of like, okay, everything is not the worst. And then yesterday I went to the zoo. I did not have a gummy before I went to the zoo, everybody. That is not what I'm recommending. And the zoo is its own gummy. But what was interesting is we were there for like 6 hours and we walked the whole time. And when I got home, you spend the day like walking and my feet were like sore and my like legs were a little tired. And I was like, oh, you know what? I think I maybe want a gummy. And so, so I think like the cool thing about these is that if you've never tried THC and you're like nervous about like too much or like you don't know what will happen, a gummy might be a nice place to like just test the waters. You might just go to sleep, which is also good.
Go to lumigummies.com and use the code FADED50 for free gummies with a limited time $50 off coupon. If you're listening to this in November, it might be too late, but you can still use the code FADEDMATES for 30% off. So go to lumigummies.com and use the code FADED50 at checkout for a free jar of gummies for a limited time. Again, that's lumigummies.com and code FADED50. Thanks to Lumi Gummies for sponsoring this week's episode. She ends up killing him, right? Like there's a gun and Dylan comes and everything goes crazy and she ends up killing him. And the thing that's like fascinating then is she is in that way, even though it's not what she wasn't looking to kill him. She is now free of that man, right? This land is hers free and clear, right? Like the path all of a sudden is kind of open, is different for her. But it's Dylan by leaving his mountain and coming back and getting embroiled with Ben and Max and what happened and this other bad guy who appears. Now it's Dylan who is the one who all of a sudden is vulnerable. And that's why this shift to him being the point of view, the first person narrator, is so fascinating because she is now in the better place and he's the one who is
right. He's broken.
Now it's his book, right? Now we have to really deal with the things that broke me if I'm going to make myself good enough to be with her.
Mm-hmm.
That's so good.
And then that's the book, right? The book is how do you rebuild yourself for a woman worthy, like make yourself worthy of this woman, which is just great. All romance should be that. Like, how do I make myself worthy of this woman?
And I think that to me is also, it's like really compelling because there's a lot of scenes where what we see Dylan doing, and we see Annie having to let him do it in book 2, is having him be like triggered emotionally and want to flee and deciding to stay, right? Like very powerfully, like this is the work of romance. It's hard. And if he wants to have this future with her, it means like building it up, like piece by piece, difficult conversation by difficult conversation, argument by argument, right? And at one point I thought this, like, he says to her, like, do you promise not to hurt me? And it is like, I don't know, it was amazing, right? Because usually it's like where he's really saying, like, you could destroy me and my family destroyed me. And he has to have it out with his father, right? Where he's like, didn't you never came to the hospital after the fire? Didn't you? And, did you even know about it? Like there's all these questions that he has to have answered. And we love Ben by this point. And Ben's like, yes, we knew. And we didn't come. And you know what is fascinating? He never explains it or tries to justify it.
No.
Right?
Yeah.
And Dylan has to forgive him anyway.
Yeah. Well, because he's been through it. It's because of Annie. Like, it's because Annie has shown him Ben right through a different lens. I mean, it really is. It is all the things we talk about romance being, right? Like, the partnership between the two of them, the love between the two of them really does evolve both of them in, like, powerful ways. And it's in ways that you don't necessarily always see in romance, right? Like, that's the end game, but, like, these two really do make massive shifts in identity because of the other.
And because they, like, again, urgently decide that they know that they can't be the same as they were, right? I mean, we talked about this before, right? Like, if romance is anything, right, it's like you have this base state for each character or the characters when the book begins, and then they meet each other and like they change, but then at some point they realize, I could go back, but it means losing this person. This book does this for Dylan, this arc for Dylan, probably better than anybody I've ever seen do it. In terms of really believing that he is deciding every day to just make it work with her. Right? Yeah. Despite her stubbornness, right? Ben, it turns out, has cancer. She refuses to leave him, even though there's all this danger from Max's motorcycle club. Like, there's all this, a lot of secondary external plot, like, kind of appears in book 2 that was not really, it was hinted at in book 1.
Yeah, like, the cancer's hinted at in book 1. I feel like this book, reading it in 2024, was a real, like, it was really powerful. And I think part of the reason why is because I think on top of all of the, obviously, the domestic violence through line, there is a very real through line in this book of, like, the power of women's anger. And the way the world treats women, right? There's this great line in the first book where she thinks to herself, like, sometimes a woman's freedom all came down to money. And then there's another moment, like, and that's when, like, she's looking at Tiffany, right? She's seeing, like, Tiffany's life and how she escaped because she had access to $3,000, right? And then Joan, steps into that scene with Tiffany that first time and is basically like, what are we supposed to do? Nothing. Like, in this way of, like, really resisting the way the world treats women, right? Joan, who is at that point a stripper, right? Like, so we know Joan has seen the way the world treats women on a daily basis, right? And I think there's something very powerful throughout this whole book and through the second book of, like, the way women resign themselves to the world and then the way they resist it. And I think, like, tiny acts of resistance and large ones, but, like, acts of resistance are threaded throughout this whole duology. And, like, it's a very powerful read in 2024.
The Joan, Tiffany, Annie triumvirate is really fascinating to me because one of the things that I found myself thinking is, like you, kind of who's in what position at any given time, right? Who is stronger or weaker, who needs help or support, who has to be talked into, right? And so, right, like you, the scene at the birthday party where Annie is terrified and she sees Joan and she's like, we have to get out of here. Like he's there. And right, like, and Joan, and it's like the first time that Annie sees what could be next for her.
Yes, because she's terrified. She's triggered by the experience.
And that's it. Like, we don't blame her. We are like, yes, get yourself to safety, but at the expense of Tiffany, right? Not being safe for her kids. One of my favorite scenes in this book, though, in the second book, is, so it turns out that Tiffany's husband is Phil. And in this whole kerfuffle at some point, Dylan realizes that Phil is at the trailer park and is like, get the fuck out of here. Like, you're not staying here. You are not. And Tiffany realizes that, like, this is her chance to essentially, like, free herself from Phil in some kind of meaningful way. And so, you know, she essentially is like, I'm not going with you. We're not going. The kids and I are going to stay here. But Phil's brother, it turns like now the secrets come back, right? Phil's brother Blake is Dylan's partner. And it turns out that Phil has, I know, Phil has, I mean, like, that is a little whatever. Phil has never told Blake or their mother that he's married or that he has kids. So his mother doesn't know she has grandchildren, which is awful, right? Like, almost like unbearably awful. And Dylan immediately is like, I'm pretty fucked because I cannot be the one to tell Margaret, right, that Phil has a wife and kids, and they have been less than an hour from her forever, right? Like,
and treated
garbage,
abysmally.
Right? So he calls Blake instead. And this is, you guys, this is an amazing scene. Blake burns down from the mountain with his Porsche and his checkbook. I guess Venmo didn't exist. Fine.
Bless.
And Tiffany is like, he's not going to meet the kids. I will meet him. I will vet him, but he can't meet my kids. Because she's really thinking, like, if it turns out that there is family, I am doing my kids a disservice by not. Now, Tiffany also kind of, like, screwed over Annie. Like, Phil told Hoyt where she was, and Tiffany was maybe complicit in that. And so there's a lot of forgiveness that's also happening where Annie has to be able to say, like, women in this situation aren't really that free, and maybe she could have worn, right? Like,
yeah,
right? She realizes
is a trap.
how easy it is to forgive her for that. When Blake comes in, he's basically like, okay, I'll give you $10,000 to just, like, walk away. But you can never tell my mother. And Tiffany, who we think of as kind of being a doormat for the entire book, is like, well, I guess it's going to cost you 15 because now I'm going to tell her because you're an asshole. Right? And he's like, says something, and she's like, and now it's 20.
And everybody, just in case you wondered, their book is Wait for It, number 4 in this series, because of course it is.
Joan and Max are book number 3. Which, by the way, the irony is I love the first 3 books so much, but book 4 I reread all the time. I think it's, like, a little less, like...
Well, you like a hero who comes down off the mountain with a checkbook.
I'm sad to report one of my all-time favorite Elizabeth Lowell books, and I'm embarrassed by this because he's terrible to her. The original book is called The Ding and Verse Touch. And she gets, she thinks she can't, I don't know. It's like one of these Elizabeth Lowell setups. Everybody, let me tell you, I'm sorry. He is, shipbuilder. She's a photographer. She is paying single-handedly with her photography because it's the 80s for her twin siblings to go to medical school. And she's about to make her last payment. And, the big check from Energistics isn't coming in, but she falls in love with this man next door and they have this affair. And she is, like, in dire straits. She's, like, not eating and, her health is shitty and she's going to the doctor. Like, even though she's poor, she's 80, so she has great health insurance. Did people even need it back then? You just went to the doctor.
Sure.
And she ends up getting pregnant. And because they never used birth control, of course, because it's the 80s. And her doctor,
we didn't know about that in the 80s.
There's no way your body is healthy enough for this. I just need you to prepare yourself. You're probably going to have a miscarriage. But if you want to, get in bed right now and don't get back up. And Travis, this asshole, comes over and basically like thinks she's trying to trap him. And he writes her a check and she turns on the stove, Sarah, and sets it on fire.
As any good heroine would do.
And honestly, it's amazing. He's terrible. Her. Yeah.
Too bad, though, because the other good option
now it's
is
20.
To say it's going to cost you double.
As Tiffany does. Yeah. So, yeah. I mean, listen, Molly O'Keefe definitely has read
Tiffany's not stupid. Tiffany knows that she has to get that bag because she doesn't know where the next meal is coming from. So you're damn right.
Yeah.
Blake, whatever your name is, that it's going to cost you
great.
20.
It's a great scene because it's also this moment where the smallest, the woman who has been the smallest, right, who has had to be small, comes out, like realizes, like, you know, we see her coming out of this. Oh God, this book's so good.
Yeah.
I love this book I love these books. I guess I should say these books so much. The sex is so hot. At one point in the first book, Dylan tells her to go to strip. Like, she's like, oh yeah, Joan and I were skinny dipping. And he's like, excuse me? And
oh yeah, there is a real Jen.
Oh yeah, right. The voyeurism's off the charts, and he sends her to the strip club, and Joan's kind of like, "What are you doing here? You're just a baby." But then Joan is also like, "If you want to go in the back and watch my friend give this guy a blowjob, you can." And she calls Dylan, right? Calls Dylan, and like they're each getting off while she's describing what she's seeing. Oh. Listen, the sex in this book, they have so much sex.
They do, and it's so good.
Because it's all about it, right?
It's so good.
It's so good.
It's the perfect structure of sex in a romance novel because every single time they are intimate with each other, it is unraveling them. Like, there is no moment of sex in this book that isn't making everything worse.
Yeah. But at the same time, one of the other things that this book does really well, right, is she had gone to Catholic church and, like she has this modesty. Her mother was a little crazy. She wasn't allowed to do things that other girls were supposed to do. And she describes to Dylan on the phone a scene where she watched Layla, the cousin, right, give a guy a hand job for in exchange for him buying them a 6-pack of beer. And it's really brilliant the way, like, the things that she says to him that she's interested in, that he then provides to her for herself, right? Not just like, you don't have to just watch. We can do this, you and me. Oh, God.
It's really a terrific book. And, there are 4 of them. So there are 2 it's a duology followed by Joan and Max's book, which is Burn Down the Night. And then Tiffany and Blake's book, which is Wait for It. And then there are a bunch of other M. O'Keefe books and Molly O'Keefe books. And a new one coming. Yeah.
One of the things I really admire about, and we've talked about this before, is like Molly has a very clear, like, okay, so it's like if she's Molly Fader, they're like women's fiction. If it's Molly O'Keefe, it's contemporary romance. And if it's M. O'Keefe, it's like bringing the heat, right? It's just real hot. And I think it's really cool to like have such a clear delineation of like your writing personas. Right? Here's what you are going to expect as a reader if you read these. And here's what, here's, and it's pitch perfect, right? Yeah.
It's terrific. It's a terrific book.
I love them. I should reread Burn Down the Night. It's been a while. I like, it's almost one of those books that's so good to me that I think it's.
That's the one where, like, there's the whole thing that happens just outside of the strip club.
Yeah, I don't want to spoil it, but, like, basically Joan and Max are on the run at the end of this book.
Yeah.
The thing that I realized, though, I think I knew this, but is I am pretty sure that this is the book that, along with the Joanna Wilder book, like, I probably read them real close together, turned me into, like, onto the motorcycle club thing. Right?
Well, it's interesting, though, because it's like motorcycle club
for sure.
though.
Yes,
until the end.
Right. And I think the other reason it's not motorcycle club light is, like, there's a body count. You know, a lot of the motorcycle club books that exist now, it's all, like, off page and in theory, right? And in fact, these are bad dudes, right? In fact, I was just looking. I read Reaper's Property by Joanna Wild July 15th, 2016. And then Burn Down the Night was July 19th, 2016. Like,
there you go.
I was like,
I guess I better read this one then.
That was a good week for me. July of, I think that's probably what drew me in finally. I was like, all right, I'm doing it. Oh, Amazon telling me when I read things. Bless.
Making you remember your life
via
books.
That $20,000 check, boy, it really comes back to bite Blake in the ass.
Well, I mean, and that's the thing that she sort of... So Tiffany's always, like, when she writes Tiffany on the page, Tiffany is always sort of related to money. There's a great moment in the first book where Tiffany gives... Annie dyes her hair, and it's too dry, and Tiffany gives her, like, sample packets of conditioner. And Annie knows, like, this is expensive. Like this is a prized possession, right? Like these sample packets, because you didn't have to pay for them. And Tiffany's like, no, take them. And the line is something like, Annie was so rich right then. Like she felt wealthy.
She had this.
Because like she had this thing that like really was luxury. And Tiffany had given it to her.
And that's the thing, I think, too. Like, there's this great scene where the three of them, like, get drunk on, like, the cheapest booze. It's like, you know, it's like, what was it? Like, vat of pina colada. Like, there's all these different ones, right?
Yeah, whatever it is. Yeah.
I think the other thing I really found myself thinking about when I read this book is how much I appreciated some of the really fine detail work that Molly does with characterization. And showing Annie, like, noticing these things. So, for example, she goes into the bathroom in Tiffany's trailer, and there's this, like, ribbon, like, hanging from, like, I don't know, like, the medicine cabinet or, like, you know, whatever, like, the towel rack. And it has barrettes clipped to it for her daughter's hair. And there's this way that Annie looks around and thinks, like, what a good mom she's trying to be, despite the fact that this terrible man is in their lives. And I really found myself over and over again thinking how finely wrought all those little details were about like how people care for each other. Right? Like at one point, Ben is building this outdoor stove because it's too hot to cook inside and he gets really tired. It's like an early sign that something's physically wrong with him. And Annie, like, knows that it's a waste of cement. So she, like, finishes more layers. Right? Like, it's just like really small ways that people take care of each other.
Well, there is a real sense of happily ever after in this book.
Yeah.
In these books, right? Like, there is even though, like, we know there are two more coming, right? But, like, Molly's not going to leave any of these characters on the table, right? They are all going to get their happily ever after, which is the joy of a romance novel with this kind of cast. Like, these are all decent people who get to have decent endings. And that is really powerful stuff.
Yeah, I agree.
Well, we liked it.
We did. We liked it a lot.
We'll read anything Molly O'Keefe writes is here at Fate of Mates. So keep going, Molly. We love you. I'm Sarah McLean. I'm here with my friend Jen Prokop. We are Fated Mates. You can find us every Wednesday in your podcasting app. Please don't forget to subscribe to the podcast in those podcasting apps. And if you ever feel like leaving us a review, we sure love that. You can also find us online at many of the social media locations under Fated Mates or Fated Mates Pod. We're most active on Blue Sky and Instagram these days, but you can find us everywhere else as well. If you are up for just making sure we land this election, you guys, please join us on Saturday to phone bank into one of many states that need our help. You can do that by visiting fatedmates.net/fatedstates. If you would love to make sure that we bring Pennsylvania State Legislature home blue to make sure that when Kamala Harris wins the election, we certify that election, you can do that at fatedmates.net/giving circle. And what else? You can find Jen's brilliant show notes at fatedmates.net every week. And last week, we ran a sample of the audiobook of June Westwood's Grave Temptation at the end of the episode. That audiobook wasn't available through audiobook purchasing apps, but it is this week, so we're going to rerun it this week so that you guys all have a chance to head right over to buy that book. Thanks again to June Westwood for sponsoring the episode last week, and we hope you guys love this historical.
Grave Temptation. Victorian Rogues, Book 1. Written by June Westwood. Narrated by Timothy Campbell. Chapter 1. London, 1873. Under the cloak of darkness was the best time to bury a body, and if there was one thing Thomas Castle knew, it was how to properly dispose of the dead. As he plunged his shovel into muddy earth, moonlight and the corpse wrapped in burlap at his feet were the only witnesses to his grim undertaking. He had precisely 30 minutes until the Highgate Cemetery watchman made his rounds. Ample time to finish digging the shallow grave, deposit his ward, and slip back into the labyrinthine streets beyond Swain's Lane. Thomas wiped away a drop of rain that ran down the side of his face, inhaling the scent of damp moss and unfurling ostrich ferns. With London in the full bloom of spring, the disguise of night would ebb away as days grew longer, giving him less time to work. Rows of tombstones cast long, ghoulish shadows on freshly turned soil as he dumped another shovelful of dirt on top of the growing heap. Abruptly, he heard a noise, not the typical rustling of nocturnal rodents or the call of a night owl. It sounded like breathing. Laboured breathing that was coming from... Dear Lord, it was coming from inside the burlap sack. Kneeling, Thomas reached out, willing away the tremor in his gloved hand. With one fist clenched on the sack and the other tightening around the handle of his dagger, he wrenched the fabric away and thrust the weapon down fiercely. Just before the sharp tip pierced through a grey shirt sleeve, the corpse rolled to one side and coughed, narrowly missing the blade as his dagger found purchase in the soggy ground. Thomas yanked the steel back and lunged at the corpse, or rather the flesh-and-blood person who had sprung unceremoniously back to life. He leaped on the figure and used his forearm to press against an unexpectedly delicate collarbone, holding the knife in an underhand grip aimed straight for the jugular vein. He found himself inches away from rounded emerald eyes, glassy and unfocused. They held the familiar air of someone drugged with laudanum. Thomas let the primal adrenaline in his body dissipate and lowered his knife to the ground so as not to frighten the woman further. "Who are you, miss?" he demanded, removing his body weight so she could breathe. "And how is it that you switched places with a dead man?" Her pale face contorted with horror. "A dead man?" Raindrops gathered in the fine strands of her auburn hair, wetting the shoulders of her high-necked dress. "If you knew who that cretin was, you'd be glad he was slain," Thomas grimaced, peeling off his thick leather gloves. Few knew the depths of depravity men like Percival Crawley, the cretin in question, were capable of. How they took young boys, cut them down with 1,000 barbaric slashers, and remoulded them into the deadliest fighters in East London. As long as Thomas had a dagger in his pocket and a shovel to pierce the ground, he would pick off the East End syndicate leaders one methodically dug hole at a time. Now a solitary wrinkle threatened to unravel his well-formed plans. A missing body turning up where he didn't expect it. Or worse, not turning up at all. He couldn't decide which possibility was less preferable. The woman inched away, her face growing more ghostly by the second. "Who put you up to this? And where have you taken me?" "I haven't knowingly taken you anywhere. Now I'll have your name, there's not much time," he commanded in a tone that had toppled the resolve of many a syndicate captain. If the watchman discovered him in the act, the entire operation would be ruined. Highgate Cemetery was host to many nooks and foliage-devoured crannies. Should detectives thoroughly inspect the remote moss-covered recesses of the surrounding area, they would discover traces of loose soil over grave sites that should have long been at rest. Thomas couldn't have that. Not if he wanted to stop the East End Syndicate's reign of terror for good. Shivers racked her body, and her voice was groggy and slow.
"Why should I tell you anything? You must be a killer."
"Only when a person needs killing." Her eyes grew larger and her tone dwindled to a strained whisper.
"What are you? Some kind of vigilante? Some kind of monster?"
Many would agree with both descriptions. Leaning on her hands, she dragged herself back another inch. If she wasn't careful, she'd tumble right into the pit he'd dug nearly 4 feet deep, were he to hazard a guess. She squinted over his shoulder at the chapel building. Carved stonework, narrow windows, and stately finials quietly lorded over the darkness. Her gaze shifted to the north. Monumental pillars led to the Egyptian Avenue passageway, flanked by tombs sealed with York stone doors.
"Hell is much colder than I expected,"
she said, her fingers clenching a clump of wet grass to steady herself.
"But you can't be the devil. You lack the required horns."
She gave him a bleary once-over and added, "And hooves." Her parched ramblings trailed off as her eyes landed on his exposed wrist. Thomas must have pushed his sleeve up while taking off his gloves, revealing one of the many white, crescent-shaped scars that scored his body. He quickly yanked his cuff down, hiding the old wound. She hauled herself back, blinking as if trying to focus her blurred vision. Thomas shoved his gloves into his pocket. "Stay still, otherwise I'll have to pick you up and carry you." If she moved much more, she would tumble backward into the grave. He wouldn't allow her to get hurt, especially since he'd unwittingly delivered her here like a sack of ill-fated turnips. Just then a black spider scurried across her fingers. At the arachnid's 8 spindly legs skittering across her flesh, the woman shrieked and jerked back. Without hesitation, he grabbed hold of her thigh with one large hand. They both froze. A flush fanned Thomas's neck. "Don't move another inch." He had meant for the words to be a stern warning, but instead they sounded like a husky rumble. His gloves must have prevented him noticing her warmth when he'd carried her into the cemetery, for even now her slight form conducted heat into his hand and up his forearm. When Thomas had embarked on his task that evening, he knew the body would be a fresh kill. But not this fresh. She stared at the spot where they made contact, then back at him, her eyelids fluttering rapidly. The woman opened her mouth, and Thomas braced for her scream. But instead of letting forth a cry that would rattle Highgate Cemetery's skeletons in their coffins, her eyes rolled back and she slumped to the ground in a cold faint. If he were not so accustomed to people being terrified of him, he might have taken offense. The light of a lantern swinging in the distance stole his attention. Damn, the watchman had arrived early. If he didn't move now, Thomas would be caught. He lifted the green-eyed siren into his arms. Lightly placing his hand over her mouth, he leaned closer. His lips brushed her earlobe, which sent a current of awareness down his spine. "Don't make a sound. Dead or alive, you're coming with me." Chapter 2. The space between consciousness and sleep blended in Abigail's murky dreams. Or had they been nightmares? Her brother must have sent the devil himself to fetch her after her desperate escape attempt. Abigail's eyes remained shut, and her back rested against soft cushions with the crackle of a fire emanating from somewhere in the room. A sharp voice cut through the atmosphere and caused her muscles to tighten with dread. "Bungling the Berry isn't like you, Castle, all the bodies you've disposed of, and now you seem to have met your downfall. Her." Abigail's breath stalled, her head pounding. This man the stranger spoke of, Castle, could have hurt her, but his violent response halted the instant he saw her face. Did he know he had the sister of an earl within his grasp? Castle had whispered something to her, but she could not remember what he said. She wiggled numb toes inside her leather boots, saying a silent prayer of thanks that some feeling had returned to her extremities. If anyone discovered who she was and what she ran from, ruination would promptly follow like the swift slice of a guillotine, destroying Abigail's chance of having the future she craved. One where she was free to make her own decisions, far away from her betrothed and her dishonourable brother, the Earl of Hargrave. Her throat cleared impatiently, and its owner's rich timbre stole the air from her lungs. Percival Crawley's body vanished, but mark me, those East End bastards will pay the price. Frost, we'll utilise your intelligence connections at Scotland Yard. McGrath, I'll need your help finding Crawley's body. These trafficking weasels won't get away with whatever games they're playing this time. The voice belonged to the man who had almost killed her. She was sure of it. He didn't know she'd awoken, but now she possessed critical information. His name and the names of 2 other men. Abigail squinted through lids that protested with drowsy grit. Crystal blue eyes met hers with a force so visceral that Abigail would have stumbled backward were she not already sitting down. The memory of his face was an insufficient echo of reality, for the glow of flickering golden light brought Castle's striking features into focus. His hair was black as midnight, and barely tamed. The shadow of a beard dusted a square jaw with a full mouth. Honeyed skin gleamed with bronze lustre, and a straight nose flared with disdain. The man's height was giant, even this foreign room that boasted palatial ceilings and a cavernous interior. He was leaning against a large oak desk, but stood straight when he saw she was awake. The lengthening of his spine caused him to grow impossibly taller, and his savage stare roved over her with the shrewd interest of a man accustomed to taking control. Decided to return to the land of the living? Castle's voice was every bit a smoky growl, leashed power rolling off him in waves. She forced her eyes away to avoid his direct gaze and take in her surroundings. Burgundy velvet drapes spilled from tall windows like recklessly spent blood, their texture complementing pristinely polished wood panels gleaming in the low candelabra light. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with ancient tomes towered up every available wall, a sight that she usually would have revelled in, were she not so concerned with the over 6 foot, 200-pound danger in front of her. 3 men regarded her from their respective vantage points in the library. One stood next to a marble fireplace that popped and sizzled with orange flames. His dark blonde hair was neatly combed back from chiselled features, which were marred by a nose that was bent and slightly off-centre, as though it had been broken several times before. With an elbow resting on the mantel, the other on his hip, his relaxed posture concealed a bound strength beneath his dove-grey waistcoat and crisply knotted white cravat. Another of the unyielding devils watched her from an overstuffed leather chair positioned near a rosewood pianoforte, gazing at her with an eerie calm. A brutal scar interrupted his right eyebrow and sliced the skin over his cheekbone. The man assessed her with a discerning look, making her feel even more vulnerable than she already was. Their gazes pierced her like keen arrows. Contemplative, calculating, unnerving stillness hearkened the hunger of a pack of wolves who smelled blood on the wind.
Where am I?
She managed, through chattering teeth. Her abductor stalked forward, frosty sapphire eyes dilated as they continued to observe her. Abigail was propped up in the corner of a maroon sofa, but at his sudden advance drew her knees up and tucked them to her chest, forming a protective ball. She thrust a hand out in a staying plea.
Don't come any closer.
Castle slowly raised both hands to chest level, palms open. Had I intended to hurt you, I could have done so already. Easily. He was right, of course. If he had ill intentions, the man could have done anything he pleased while she was unconscious. Castle leaned forward and Abigail stiffened. Instead of placing his enormous hand around her neck and snapping it like a dry twig, he reached past her, pulled a garnet cashmere lap robe from the back of the couch, and arranged it about her shoulders. The blanket's warmth enveloped her, thawing some of the goosebumps from her arms. She pulled it closer to her body, greedily absorbing its warmth. Then Castle reached into his pants pocket, produced an ivory-handled dagger, and removed the leather sheath. With a yelp, Abigail jolted back, turning her head and shielding her face. This was it. He would slit her throat within milliseconds, and her vision would forever go black. Would she finally see her mother again in heaven? 10 years had been a long time to face this world alone, an eternity without Sarah Richmond's warm smile. Something made a muffled thud next to her on the sofa. She cracked one eyelid open, then the other, and the milky handle of the small weapon shone back at her. Castle straightened. There, now you are armed, and I am not. Abigail peered down at the length of steel, then looked at each of the Leviathans' faces. The odds of coming out victorious against 3 mountainous men, even armed with a blade, were nil. As bizarre as it was, she decided it would be wise to accept the offering. The last thing she wanted to do was offend Castle and chance raising his ire. He was a dangerous man, after all. Abigail dipped her chin in a hesitant nod. "Thank you, Mr. Castle." One of his black brows rose and he exchanged looks with Frost and McGrath. I couldn't help but overhear you a moment ago," Abigail said, running her fingers over the knife's handle in a nervous flutter, not quite bringing herself to pick it up. The thought of holding such a thing, let alone piercing someone's skin with it, even in self-defense, made her queasy. Castle's expression was smooth. The only deviation was a slight tensing of his jaw. Right there. So it was possible to drive a wedge beneath his armor of ice. Curious. Perhaps Abigail could use the information to her advantage. It was a strange notion, engaging in mental chess against such a seemingly impervious opponent. But could she deliver a checkmate before he knew what she was about? Or before he touched her again? Castle's attention fixed on her. "Seeing as how you know my name, I'll get to the crux of the matter. Does the East End Syndicate mean anything to you? Perhaps you or your family owe them a debt and cannot pay?" Tension in the room kicked up as the 3 awaited her answer. She regarded each of the men, her nerves a brittle sphere of glass. Was this some sort of test? Abigail gathered the blanket firmly about her shoulders as though it could protect her from the consequences of giving the wrong answer. "I've heard of the organisation, as most people in London have. A ruthless lot who plague the streets with pickpockets and prostitution. I have no affiliation with them and never have." "Nor anyone close to you?" "Nor anyone—" Her mind snagged on a picture of her brother, too full of greed and hubris to think twice about making a duplicitous deal. "Nor anyone close to me," she finished with a shaky breath. Upon their father's death, Eldon had inherited not only the title of Earl of Hargrave, but their sire's penchant for gambling and whoring as well. The last of the Hargrave fortunes squeezed to ash in the fist of a feckless drunk. The wealth that her loathsome betrothed, Clarence Montague, would provide had drowned out Abigail's protestations. The promise of refilling the Earl of Hargrave's coffers proved too enticing an offer for the impoverished nobleman to pass up. Nobleman? Abigail clenched her teeth. The title was one that her older brother was wholly unworthy of, for he was not noble at all. He was spineless, a spoiled brat, gifted with the weapon of aristocratic influence and her life with which to barter. No matter what she did, she could not let these 3 men know the depths of her misery. Nothing good came when a man sensed a woman's weakness. Abigail regarded the 3 giants as if they didn't have the ability to crush her between a thumb and forefinger. "The last thing I recall was walking home alone on Palmer Street in Westminster. Someone jumped out from the shadows of an alley and grabbed me. The man pushed me against a wall and forced some foul-tasting liquid down my throat. I came to in the graveyard, but don't remember much after." Her cheeks heated, and she glanced at the thigh Castle had scorched with his hand. Abigail had not been walking to her home, but heading away from it in the dead of night. The small reticule holding £10 for her journey was long gone, presumably stolen by the wretch who also stole her opportunity for escape. Imperative details that Castle need not know. She chewed her bottom lip. What if one of the men in this library had drunked her? But whoever pushed her against a brick wall and pried her mouth open wouldn't have been equal to the size of these 3 men. Her attacker had not felt mammoth, he'd been slight, yet strong against her back. Castle gestured to his compatriots. "Since you already know who I am, allow me to introduce you to our company. Connor McGrath," he nodded toward the man with the scar, "and Damien Frost." He lifted his chin to the distinguished, tawny-haired man by the fireplace. My business associates. Frost scoffed, pieces of golden light shining in his closely cropped beard. His mouth curved into what would be considered a smile on a less imposing man, but it only resembled the bearing of pointed white canines on him. Business associates, indeed. Don't let him fool you. We are the only two he calls friends. Flicking an irritated glance at Frost, Castle continued. Just when our long-suffering mission is gaining momentum, Crawley's body went missing. Yours in his place. What say you to that, miss?
Pritchard. Abigail Pritchard. I would say it's a pleasure, but...
She swept the room with unsteady vision.
That would certainly prove me a lie, wouldn't it? I must admit that I don't know what to make of all this.
Now she could identify each of them by sight and name. But a question lingered in the back of her mind. Why would Castle provide their names so readily? Surely the police would find this information valuable. The criminal was a small man, Frost said. A similar height to yourself. That is likely why Castle did not detect anything was amiss until it was too late. Abigail's stomach roiled. Her body had touched the spot where a dead man once lay. The thought should have made her want to get up and run. Whether it was the after-effects of the drug or the idea of going back home to an existence more bleak and hopeless than she could stand, Abigail remained seated. In all her 24 years, she never thought she would end up the foil for some criminal enterprise mix-up, and just as she was on her way to taste freedom for the first time in her life. Crawley was a heartless butcher and deserved every bit of what he got, Castle said in a cold clip. His nickname was the Thimble because he was as small as a fingertip. They spoke of dead bodies and missing outlaws as casually as discussing the weather. Abigail's chest squeezed at the thought of her life ending in a lonely grave. The question was, how had she been switched with Crawley and why? Part of her was too frightened to know the answer. Can you think of anyone who bears ill will toward you? Conor McGrath's deep monotone held the faint whisper of a Scottish brogue bending his vows. Enough ill will to see you buried alive.
Of course not.
Abigail's hand covered her heart, a sharp pain needling her chest. Did she? McGrath turned to Castle. You sure Crawley was dead? Very sure. Castle narrowed his eyes at McGrath. Frost pushed off the mantle and took several paces to the sofa. Now that we find ourselves with a maid who knows too much, what shall we do with her?
Maid? Who are they? Oh, yes.
Abigail glanced down at the pilfered grey cotton uniform she had donned before making her escape. Her white cap must have gotten lost in that dreadful cemetery. Pressing stiff lips together, she regarded each of the men's wolfish faces. She couldn't go back, not now. Eldon would punish her for trying to run away. Perhaps this time he would make good on threats to hobble her so she could not escape. If Abigail was marked by the East End Syndicate, her hastily crafted plans of fleeing to Cardiff or Swansea in Wales to find work as a shopgirl were ruined before they'd begun. On the other hand, could she risk throwing herself at the mercy of Castle and these murderous men? Castle could have callously thrown her into the grave and not looked back, but instead he had taken her with him and she remained unharmed. If she returned to her brother's keeping, Abigail would become the victim of a violent, vengeful storm. The scenario would end in marriage to a cruel, common-born man who only wished to use her to gain proximity to the aristocracy. The thought made her nauseous. Anything would be better than that. Send her home. Castle's voice sliced like a knife through her troubled thoughts. But I warn you, Miss Pritchard, have a care. Be wary of dark shadows on your trail. Maybe you were the most convenient body to throw in a sack, or you've met a very dangerous enemy. He nodded to McGrath. You may escort her. Take my carriage. McGrath stood, broad shoulders testing the seams of a coal shirt, bruised knuckles swinging at his sides as he advanced toward her.
Wait.
A pathetic note of panic squeaked from her throat.
I can't leave. There isn't a body in that empty grave or soil to fill it. If whoever did this sees me on the streets, they'll surely finish the job.
Which is why my advice is to disappear, Miss Pritchard, came Castle's hollow reply. Go to a place where no one can find you.
Cold fear ate at Abigail's insides. That's impossible.
Who knew what fate would await her if she was left to her own devices? Should the brigands get hold of her, Abigail could end up slumped over in an alley with her throat cut, a trail of blood running down her limp hand to mingle with the grime and muck of London's cobblestone streets. A jumble of words left her mouth before she could pull them back, as perilous as a deadly avalanche.
Let me stay. You can take me on as a maid-of-all-work. I won't be any trouble.
She clamped her hands together in her lap to keep from spinning apart.
At least allow me to remain for a few weeks. I just need a place to hide until the danger passes.
Castle scowled, a knot forming low on his forehead. The danger will never pass, Miss Pritchard. If you knew what I know, that would be obvious.
Silence stretched so long that Abigail thought she might faint.
Only her pounding pulse in her ears and intermittent pops from the fireplace disrupted the charged pause. Damien Frost was the first to speak, running one hand over his beard with a thoughtful stroke. With the scale of this place, she would be lost in a litany of things to do. McGrath grunted. With only a few maids on staff, Mrs. Ramkin would welcome the help.
The ever-present furrow between Castle's black brows deepened.
I'll thank you both for keeping your machinations to your own households, not mine.
Why, I would be a great help to the existing staff, Abigail pleaded around a sour lump in her throat, and I am lovely company.
Castle's irises were iridescent blue jewels chipped with flecks of gold. I can imagine how you would make lovely company, Miss Pritchard, which is the very reason it would not be wise to keep you under the same roof as I am.
Did that sentence carry the entendre she thought it did?
Danger lurked in the dark streets of London. Danger stood before her, with a rogue's provocation. Ice-blue eyes challenged her green ones, a tempestuous wave crushing over mossy emerald earth.
And if I leave, what would stop me from going to the police?
Abigail's voice was nothing more than a hushed whisper. She trod on treacherous ground. Even broaching such a subject put her in unfathomable peril. One false step and she could end up a footnote in this man's endless catalogue of sins. Castle stilled. Is that a threat, Miss Pritchard? He stalked forward and stopped directly before her on the couch. His tall frame filled her vision and made Abigail's stomach shrivel. The last person foolish enough to threaten me ended up without a tongue to produce such unwise utterances. As for your half-baked scheme, going to the police wouldn't do much good, as I have countless coppers in this city on my payroll. Such are the benefits of possessing vast resources. I pay people to look the other way and buy the respect of those who would oppose me. What I can't do is coerce a grown woman to come to her senses. Now tell me, do you wish to make yourself my enemy? If she hadn't been in a sticky situation before, Abigail had just fallen into a barrel of pitch.
That was not my intention, she said quickly. I only wanted you to reconsider sending me away so soon after being attacked, is all.
Abigail slid one hand beside her hip and covered the dagger handle with her fingertips. The weapon was smooth and cold to the touch. One movement would put it in her palm. One deft throw would pierce his flesh. But she wouldn't discover if Castle's blood ran as hot and crimson as hers that night. There were still 2 other men in the library. She was desperate, not stupid. Something shifted in his impenetrable features. The hint of weariness, or an emotion close to it, creased his mouth. Cautiously, Abigail's hand drifted back to her lap. Castle pointed to the library window panes. You have no concept of what is out there, he said in a guttural baritone. Being drugged is a small mercy compared to the other horrors that haunt dark alleyways waiting to prey upon innocent women like yourself. Women who find themselves wide awake staring directly into the face of danger.
Abigail swallowed and shook her head, which is why I would spare myself the dread of finding out. Please allow me to stay, if only for a little while.
How Abigail hated to beg. She was no stranger to fear or being on the receiving end of vile threats that promised nothing but degradation and suffering. Whatever this man spoke of did not frighten her half as much as the prospect of returning to her miserable life and the desolate future that awaited. That was a reality she could not accept, no matter the cost. Castle considered her. The way he tilted his head to one side and assessed her, all of her, from bedraggled auburn hair to worn scuffed boots and every inch between, scorched her skin with white-hot sparks. Come on, Thomas, just give her over to Mrs. Rampkin and quit making the poor girl suffer, Frost said. Castle's Christian name was Thomas. The name did not sound like someone who lurked about gravesites in the dead of night. It was one more suited to a clean-shaven accountant, not the lethal man before her on the verge of deeming them enemies and crumbling Abigail's last chances of survival. The last can stay with me for a while, McGrath said from his seat near the pianoforte. There are several spare rooms in which— Absolutely not, Castle cut in, curling his hands into painful-looking fists, and tossed a baleful glance to McGrath, then regarded her with black flame burning in his eyes. You may remain here if you so choose. Abigail let out a quiet lungful of air. Thank you. Crossing the room, Castle tugged a tasseled sable bell pull. Don't thank me. He turned back to her, the fire casting half his face in shadow, the other half in a bright glow. Because if you knew what the East End Syndicate was capable of, you would be begging me to bar the doors from the inside.